You're doing a very similar thing that you were doing with the Passion of the Christ, where this is a profound story.
Yes.
When you put something like that together, how do you choose who's going to be the next Jesus?
You use him again.
Caviezel.
Mel Gibson was 69 and staring down his own mortality when a brutal 3-month hospital stay in early 2025 nearly ended everything before those viral death hoaxes even hit the internet. He finally sat with Joe Rogan and dropped the filter on the spiritual warfare involved in his healing. Additionally, Mel spoke about the secret struggles that turned his career into a $600 million battlefield. He's finally admitting what Hollywood tried to bury, all while prepping a 2026 sequel that sounds more like a mind-bending acid trip than a movie. Why is this infamous star on to that? Even Hollywood seems to be shocked. Descent into darkness. Back in the mid-90s, Mel Gibson was arguably the most powerful man in Hollywood. He had just swept the 1996 Oscars for Braveheart, and the Lethal Weapon movies were basically printing money at the box office, bringing in over $1 billion. But if you look at the footage from that era, you can see a guy who was fundamentally vibrating at a frequency of total self-destruction. Underneath all that fame, alcohol was clawing him apart. His marriage to Robin Moore was straining under the weight of his rages. There's a story he's shared about standing by a window and looking out over the city, seriously considering whether it was worth continuing at all. He was 38 years old and had everything the world says you should want. Yet he was kneeling on the floor of his room in a state of absolute desperation. It was in that moment of rock bottom that he picked up a Bible and the story of the Passion just slammed into him. It wasn't just a religious text to him anymore. It was a lifeline pulling him back from the edge of a suicidal abyss. Most people would have just gone to rehab and moved on to the next action blockbuster. But Gibson became entirely obsessed. He spent the next 10 years of his life diving headfirst into the Gospels and ancient texts like those from 2nd century preacher Melito of Sardis. He wasn't just interested in the story, he wanted to recreate the 1st century with a level of accuracy that felt almost dangerous. He pushed himself and his team to master Aramaic, the actual language spoken on the dirt streets of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, because he wanted the audience to feel the grit and the reality of the event. Now you have to understand where this intense, unfiltered drive comes from. Mel was raised in a very specific, traditionalist Catholic household that sat way outside the mainstream. His father, Hutton Gibson, was a brilliant trivia whiz, but also an outspoken skeptic who questioned everything from the legitimacy of the modern Vatican to the historical records of the Holocaust. That rebel anti-establishment streak was baked into Mel's DNA from day one, and it's exactly what fueled the fire for a movie that would eventually set the world on fire. By the early 2000s, the vision had finally crystallized into something no studio head in their right mind wanted to touch. He wanted a movie with no big stars, spoken entirely in dead languages with subtitles, and a level of violence that depicted the crucifixion in terrifying detail. When he took the idea to the big studios, they didn't just say no, they literally laughed him out of the room. They told him it was too risky, too Catholic, and essentially career suicide. But Gibson was sitting on a personal fortune of about $425 million from all those hits, so he did something that absolutely shocked the industry. He pulled $30 million of his own cash and decided to fund the entire project through his company, Icon Productions. He was going full indie rogue, betting his entire reputation and his fortune on a project everyone else called Poison. I wonder, what was the moment in your life where things felt darkest but somehow gave you a sense of purpose you didn't know you had? For Gibson, that darkness was the only thing that could have birthed something so provocative, but turning that personal inferno into a pitch for the suits at the top of the ladder was only the beginning of the nightmare. They didn't just close their doors, they slammed them shut with every excuse in the book, and that's when the real battle lines for the soul of the film were finally drawn. Hollywood's Iron Curtain. Every single door Gibson knocked on from 2002 into early 2003 bounced back harder than the last. And I mean every major player in town. You had the giants at Fox and Warner taking one look at the raw footage and basically running for the hills. Think about that for a second. They saw these visceral, unyielding, scourging scenes that went on for agonizing minutes, dialogue in dead languages that required subtitles, and a lead actor in Jim Caviezel, who wasn't exactly a household name at the time. To the suits in the high-rise offices, this wasn't just a creative risk, it was a financial death sentence. They were looking at the data and seeing a foreign film with R-rated violence and no path to a summer blockbuster audience. Now, here's where it gets truly wild. While the executives were busy predicting a total disaster, early leaks of the script started hitting the Drudge Report, which was the internet's town square back then. Suddenly, the industry was in a full-blown panic. Insiders who hadn't even seen a frame of the movie were terrified of the backlash over the portrayal of Jewish authorities, and they labeled the film poison before a single theater had even booked a showtime. The pressure was so intense that even companies Gibson had worked with for decades were suddenly unavailable to take his calls. It was a total institutional lockout. But Mel didn't flinch. Instead of playing by the Hollywood rulebook or begging for a distribution deal that would probably neuter his vision, he flipped the entire script and went completely underground. He bypassed the traditional marketing machine and started holding these private, secret test screenings in small parishes, community centers, and churches across the United States and Europe. He was essentially a traveling salesman for his own faith, carrying digital reels into darkened basements to show the film to regular people, the ones the critics and the cool studios usually ignore. The reaction in those rooms was unlike anything anyone had ever seen in the history of cinema. People weren't just watching a movie, they were having these profound, life-altering spiritual experiences right there in the folding chairs. I'm talking about people sobbing, others sitting in total silence for 20 minutes after the credits rolled, and stories of lifelong atheists walking out and heading straight to church. Word of mouth started spreading like wildfire through church bulletins, email chains, and community groups, creating a grassroots hype machine that the big studios couldn't even begin to comprehend. They were looking at spreadsheets, while Gibson was looking at souls. By the time Ash Wednesday rolled around in 2004, Gibson had sunk another $45 million of his own cash into marketing. He didn't have the backing of a major studio's PR department, so he bought his own billboards and his own TV spots, leaning hard into the controversy. The experts in the trades were still laughing, predicting a modest opening, maybe 25 or 30 million if the religious crowd actually showed up. But when February 25th hit, the reality was a total shock to the global system. The movie pulled in $83.5 million in its first 3 days alone. It didn't just break records, it shattered the ceiling of what was thought possible for an independent film, becoming the highest-grossing R-rated movie ever. Before it even opened, there were over 10 million advance tickets sold because entire parishes were renting out fleets of buses and buying out every seat in local multiplexes. By the time the dust settled that summer, it had earned $612 million worldwide. Gibson had effectively proven that if you have a vision that resonates with people's spirits, you can outmuscle the entire Hollywood machine. He bet his entire reputation and every cent of his $400 million fortune on a problem film that every expert said would fail. Think about that for a second. Would you have the guts to bet everything you've ever earned on a project that the entire world told you was a disaster waiting to happen? Most of us would have folded in the first week of rejection, but Gibson's stubbornness had just changed the industry forever. That opening weekend roar was so loud it drowned out the doubters for a moment. But waiting in the shadows, the Anti-Defamation League was already striking matches on an anti-Semitism powder keg that was about to consume Mel's world entirely. Miracles or curses? Imagine standing on the ancient, windswept stones of Matera, Italy in the fall of 2002. The production is nearing its end, and the crew is setting up for the final, most crucial shot of the crucifixion. Jim Caviezel is suspended on that cross, exhausted and physically spent, when suddenly a bolt of lightning cracks through the sky and hits him directly. It was so powerful that witnesses say they saw light coming out of his ears. The shock was so violent that he actually bit straight through his tongue and his cheek. Now you'd think that's just a freak weather accident, but wait, it gets much weirder. Jan Michelini, the assistant director, was standing right near the cross, and he got zapped by lightning as well. And get this, it was the second time he'd been hit during the production. It was as if something in the atmosphere was physically trying to stop that specific scene from being locked into the camera. Here's the thing about Caviezel's experience. It wasn't just a movie role. It was a 12-week descent into a literal physical nightmare. By the time they were filming in the quarries of Matera and the Cinecittà studios in Rome, he had developed a lung infection that turned into full-blown pneumonia. His weight dropped to a skeletal 168 pounds, and he suffered a dislocated shoulder while carrying that 110-pound wooden cross across the rocky Italian turf. Years later, he revealed that he had to undergo 2 separate open-heart surgeries, and he traces the damage directly back to the sheer physical strain of that set. And if you're looking for an eerie detail, consider that Caviezel was exactly 33 years old during filming, the same age traditional history says Jesus was at the time of the crucifixion. The atmosphere on that set felt entirely heavy, like a thick fog of spiritual tension that wouldn't lift. Gibson has since told Joe Rogan that he didn't want any fake Hollywood sound effects for the scourging scenes. During the filming of the flesh-tearing moments, the wind was whipping through those canyons and the temperature was dropping into the negatives. The actors were suffering from actual hypothermia, and when you hear those guttural, bone-chilling shrieks in the final film, those aren't actors hitting their marks. Those are the real sounds of human agony captured on tape. Gibson kept them in the final mix because he felt they carried a truth that a studio recording booth could never replicate. And the stories from the crew are honestly enough to give you chills. People were reporting these vivid, recurring nightmares of demonic faces watching them from the shadows of the set. There were moments where hardened, atheist crew members would just break down in uncontrollable sobs right in the middle of a take, unable to explain what was happening to them. Take Luca Lionello, for instance. He's the actor who played Judas Iscariot, and according to the production journals, he was a staunch, outspoken atheist when he signed on. But after filming the scene where Judas hangs himself, something shifted in him so deeply that he actually converted to Catholicism right there on the spot. He said he felt a pull from the role that he simply couldn't fight anymore. Gibson himself was reportedly praying non-stop throughout the entire process. He said he felt a constant unseen pressure shoving back against him, as if he were in a literal war with a spiritual force that didn't want this story told. But for every dark moment, there were these bizarre anomalies that felt like protection. The crew would talk about how perfect, dramatic storm clouds would part exactly when they needed a specific light for the Garden of Gethsemane, or how beams of light would hit the set in ways that shouldn't have been possible given the time of day. It was this constant, eerie push-pull between miracles and curses that left everyone questioning what kind of presence was actually ruling that set. Think about that for a second. Have you ever felt an unseen presence turn a completely normal day upside down, or felt like you were being pushed by something you couldn't see? For the cast and crew of The Passion, that wasn't a metaphor. It was their daily reality for months. But while the film was becoming a global triumph that defied every Hollywood convention, those shadows from the set were starting to follow Gibson back home. The opening weekend roar was still echoing, but the Anti-Defamation League and a choir of critics were already fanning the flames of an anti-Semitism firestorm that was about to turn his massive success into a total social exile. Was this truly spiritual tension on set just the beginning of a much darker war brewing in the shadows of Hollywood? Anti-Semitism Inferno. The firestorm didn't wait for the movie to hit theaters. The Anti-Defamation League actually smelled smoke as early as 2003, before the editing was even finished. Here's the thing. Abraham Foxman, who was the national director of the ADL at the time, fired off this private, urgent letter to Gibson. He warned that the script's portrayal of Jewish authorities clamoring for execution was essentially a throwback to those medieval passion plays that sparked centuries of pogroms and massacres across Europe. They were terrified that Gibson was about to breathe new life into a blood libel narrative that the world had spent decades trying to bury. And just like every other step of this production, Gibson didn't back down an inch. He had these private screenings for Jewish leaders and scholars who urged him to cut specific lines, particularly that one verse from the Gospel of Matthew where the crowd cries out that his blood should be on them and their children. To the critics, that line was a death sentence for Jewish-Christian relations. But to Gibson, rooted in that old-school traditionalist Catholicism that ignores the modern updates of Vatican II, the script was simply a mirror of the Gospels. He argued that the film placed the weight of the crucifixion on all of humanity's sins, not just one group, but the nuance was completely lost in the media explosion that followed. Now, here is where it gets incredibly tense. Foxman publicly blasted the film, describing the portrayal as bloodthirsty and painting Jewish people as money-hungry enemies of Christ. According to reports from the Jewish Center for Public Affairs, the fact that the plaque on the cross was written only in Latin and Aramaic, deliberately omitting Hebrew, was seen as a calculated move to sever any positive tie to Judaism's roots. At the same time, the headlines were being fueled by the controversial reputation of Mel's father, Hutton Gibson. Reporters started digging up Hutton's outspoken, radical views on the Holocaust, and suddenly, the film wasn't being judged as art. It was being treated as a manifesto of a very specific, very dangerous worldview. When the movie finally opened, the scenes in the lobbies were just as chaotic as the ones on the screen. There were widespread reports of audiences in the US and Europe fainting during the scourging scenes, with some people literally vomiting in the aisles because the brutality was so unrelenting. In some parts of Europe, you had calls for total bans and massive boycotts. Yet across Latin America and the Philippines, the reaction was the complete opposite. People were packing theaters like they were attending a holy pilgrimage, with families returning 5 or 6 times to weep in the dark. The divide was absolute. On one side, you had a secular and academic world horrified by what they saw as a legitimization of ancient hatreds. On the other hand, you had a massive global audience that felt they were finally seeing the raw, unvarnished truth of their faith. Slash Film later recapped how this firestorm peaked with massive street protests in 2004. But as we know, the box office laughed last, clearing over $600 million. It makes you wonder, though, does one untrimmed gospel line or a refusal to sanitize history actually damn an entire artistic vision forever? Gibson had won the financial war, but the social cost was a different story altogether. He had built a monument to his faith, but the heat from that anti-Semitism inferno was beginning to melt his standing in the industry he once ruled. And here's the most haunting part. As the dust settled on the release, both Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel started to realize that their massive success was carrying a heavy price. Their paths ahead were about to mirror the very story they had just told, leading to a professional exile that hit far too close to home: personal crucifixion. That anti-Semitism blaze didn't just fizzle out once the movie left theaters. It smoldered into a decade of personal hell for Mel Gibson that felt like a slow-motion wreck. Here is the thing. While the world was arguing over the film, the media started dredging up every controversial thing his father, Hutton Gibson, had ever said. Then, in 2006, the bottom completely dropped out. Those police tapes from a DUI stop leaked to the public, and hearing Gibson rage about how Jews cause all the wars in the world was the final nail in the coffin. Hollywood didn't just distance itself, it froze him out cold. He went from being the king of the industry to a total pariah overnight. And after he finished directing Apocalypto that same year, the phone basically stopped ringing for a decade. It took until Hacksaw Ridge in 2016 for the ice to even begin to crack, but the scar on his reputation was already permanent. And get this, it wasn't just Mel who felt the heat. Jim Caviezel, the guy who literally carried that 100-pound cross at the age of 33, the exact age of Jesus, watched his A-list career evaporate. Before The Passion, he was one of the most promising leading men in town. But after the movie's Firestorm, he found himself stuck in faith-based projects that the mainstream wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. He's been very vocal about how the industry basically blacklisted him for taking the role, yet he's never expressed a single regret. It's almost eerie how their real lives started to mirror the very story of suffering and exile they had just put on screen. But the physical toll didn't stop in the early 2000s. Fast forward to 2025, and Gibson's own body started betraying him in a way that felt like a karmic echo of the injuries on set. He went through a brutal medical nightmare involving a remdesivir treatment during a COVID-19 bout that left him paralyzed for 3 months straight. Think about that. One of the most energetic directors in history, lying immobile in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, just like those viral death hoaxes were claiming he had already passed away. It was during this recovery, while he was basically staring down his own mortality, that the vision for the sequel started to take on a whole new weight. Through all those years of silence and exile, the seed for a follow-up was quietly sprouting. Randall Wallace, the guy who wrote Gladiator and Braveheart, has reportedly been working on at least 6 different drafts of a script. This isn't going to be a standard linear retelling of the resurrection either. Gibson has described it as a hybrid beast that blends traditional narrative with these wild, visionary sequences that dive into other realms. It sounds less like a Sunday school lesson and more like a spiritual acid trip through heaven and hell. It makes me wonder, what is the biggest scar you've carried in your own career from standing up for something you believed was the absolute truth, even when everyone else told you to stay silent? For Gibson and Caviezel, that truth came with a price tag that most people couldn't afford to pay. They stood in the center of the fallout, and it fundamentally changed who they were as men and as artists. 2 decades have ground by in the wilderness since that first film shook the world. But in early 2025, sitting across from Joe Rogan, Gibson finally unleashed the unvarnished core of what he'd been holding back all this time. What exactly did Mel tell Joe Rogan that finally blew the lid off the industry's biggest secret? Rogan Revelation. January 2025 rolls around, and Mel Gibson walks into Joe Rogan's studio looking like a man who's finally surfaced from a long, dark tunnel. You have to remember, he was fresh off that brutal medical scare where he was paralyzed for 3 months, and he sounded like someone who had nothing left to lose by telling the absolute truth. He sat there and unloaded on how the original Passion wasn't just some movie, but a target for forces that wanted to bury the authentic, grit-covered reality of the Aramaic and Latin text. He essentially admitted that there was a coordinated effort from both industry suits and even certain Vatican insiders to push for a watered-down English version that would have stripped away all the spiritual weight. Here is where it gets truly wild. Gibson finally confirmed that the sequel, titled The Resurrection of the Christ, isn't just happening. It's going to be what he calls an absolute acid trip. He sat across from Rogan and described a film that plunges Jesus straight into the hell realms, a non-linear descent through different dimensions that sounds more like a visionary fever dream than a standard Bible story. According to Jordan Ruami, a film critic writing for World of Real, the project is officially greenlit for pre-production and will start shooting in 2026. Jim Caviezel is coming back to play the lead role at 56 years old, which is a massive leap from the 33-year-old actor who first climbed on that cross 2 decades ago. Rogan sat there looking stunned as Gibson recounted the sheer level of sabotage he's faced over the years. Mel talked about how people in high places were threatened by a film that didn't look for easy scapegoats, but instead pointed the finger at universal human sin. He linked those industry whispers and the professional blacklist directly back to those eerie anomalies on set, the lightning strikes and the nightmares, viewing it all as a singular, prolonged demonic pushback against his attempt to stay faithful to the gospel. It's like he sees his entire career as a battlefield where he was targeted for refusing to play the Hollywood game. Now, while all this was happening, the internet was going into a meltdown with these viral death hoax headlines. You've probably seen them. The ones claiming Gibson was on his deathbed, making a final confession about the truth behind the film. But when you look at the facts, it's all pure clickbait. An outlet called Media Mass actually debunked those rumors back in August 2023. And seeing him on Rogan's podcast proved he's very much alive and kicking at 69. He isn't fading away. He's actually channeling all that saved up fury into this massive 2026 production that aims to be even more provocative than the first one. Think about that for a second. We're talking about a filmmaker who has been through the literal ringer, survived a paralyzing illness, and is now planning to take the audience on a journey through the damned. It makes me wonder, are you actually ready for a version of the Jesus story that feels like a mind-bending descent into the abyss? Because the way Gibson frames it, this isn't going to be a comfortable watch for anyone expecting a Sunday school lesson. That Rogan sit-down really crystallized the truth that the Passion demanded all along. It's a truth that reshapes how we see this entire 20-year saga, not as a series of scandals and box office numbers, but as a grueling spiritual marathon for a man who refused to blink. Resurrection Rising. There is something deeply poetic about Jim Caviezel strapping back into those sandals at 56 years old. Think about that for a second. He's returning to this role over 2 decades after he first carried that cross at the age of 33. Mel Gibson confirmed the title as The Resurrection of Christ in an update featured in People magazine on January 10th, and he made it clear that this project is unfolding precisely when it was meant to, regardless of the years of delays and industry resistance. It's almost as if the timing had to align with their own personal journeys of endurance before they could even attempt to film the next part of the story. When you look back at the entire arc of this production, it's a story of absolute defiance. They started on a Matera set that literally felt like enemy territory, with lightning strikes and freak accidents trying to shut them down. They moved through a decade of blacklists, media firestorms, and Gibson's own physical breakdowns. Yet the Passion still stands as a $612 million testament to the power of a single vision. It didn't just make money, though. It ignited actual conversions. From Luca Lionello, the actor who played Judas, to theatergoers who walked in as skeptics and walked out as believers. It proved once and for all that a dedicated underground network of people who actually care about a story is infinitely more powerful than any corporate studio machine. The gatekeepers in Hollywood laughed at the idea of a movie spoken in Aramaic, but the audience proved them entirely wrong, turning an indie reject into the highest-grossing R-rated film of its time. Now, this sequel hybrid is promising to peel back layers of the resurrection that Hollywood is still too terrified to touch. Gibson isn't interested in a sanitized, safe ending. He's going for the jugular. It makes you stop and wonder, did the original Passion shift the way you look at sacrifice and the weight of history? Or do you think this next chapter is going to be the one that finally blows the lid wider on what we think we know? Because if the first film was a war for the truth of the crucifixion, this second one feels like a final stand for the spirit itself. Everything Gibson has been through over the last 20 years has been leading to this exact moment of redemption. Gibson finally spilled everything on Rogan. The Passion was a literal spiritual war fought against satanic demons and industry sabotage. His recent health crisis was just a final Calvary echo, but he's very much alive at 69, scripting Resurrection Realms for 2026. What unseen force do you think really fueled this saga? Was it a cursed production or a divine call? Drop your take in the comments.